full as usual. So we're going to get right to it, and our invocation will be given today by Tamara Johnson. Followed by Ms. Johnson, we'll have the introduction of our speaker today, Dr. Reginald Broadnax. All right? So let's give a warm welcome to Ms. Johnson as she comes up and get this thing started.
Hello, I hope everyone's having a great day. And if you don't mind closing your eyes and bowing your heads, who's going to lead us in prayer? Make us ready, attentive, and available to hear you. Thank you for the gift of being able to rise each day with the assurance that you walk through it with us. Thank you for the gifts of creativity and uniqueness and the energy to put them into good use. And with that being said, amen.
Good morning. For you who do not know me, I'm Dr. Reginald Broadnax, Division Chair of the Division of Religion and Ministry Studies. There's a show on ESPN that I love, comes on every day at 5:30. It's called Pardon the Interruption, or PTI. It's basically two old sportscasters yelling and arguing with each other for a half hour, kind of like me again. And I'm never home at 5:30, so I DVR the show every day, and later in the evening, I'll sit down and watch it. But in order to get the beginning of the show, I have to record the show ahead of it, which is called Around the Horn. I generally get about a minute of Around the Horn before PTI comes on. And when I'm watching the recording, waiting for PTI to come on one day, I saw this guy on Around the Horn. He kind of looked like someone I've seen so many documentaries and interviews with, person who was part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party back in 1964. But I said, no, that can't be him. And I kept saying, no, that can't be him. And then one day, Dennis Jr. won Around the Horn and got to do a 30-second speak on anything that he wanted. And he lifted up his book, one that's right here beside him. It's a book that he wrote about his father, David Dennis. He's David Dennis Jr. So a book he wrote about his father and his father's struggles and time and work in the civil rights movement, beginning with the Freedom Rides in 1961, really still up until this day. And as he plugged the book on the show, well, I have a one-click with Amazon, so I ordered it immediately and it came the next day. And I began reading the book. And most of you probably don't know that I've known Dr. McCorn for more years than either of us want to recount. So there's this thing called Twitter, and I took the book and I tagged Dr. McCorn and said, "You need to get the book." He responded back with the book in front of his face. And then we just bantered back and forth about the book, and all through that banter, I had tagged David Dennis. And then in a private conversation, Dr. McCorn said to me, "Why don't you invite him to come to Clinton?" So I DM'd David, and when he responded back, the first thing he said is, "You guys are wild." But we had some conversation back and forth, and I gave him my email. Well, he gave me his email, and I responded to him on my Clinton College account that says division chair. So I want him to know this was legitimate. This wasn't somebody DMing him out of nowhere. But one night I was finishing the book, and I was actually in tears. I won't tell you what it was. I want you to read it yourself. And I emailed him that night, told him how I felt about reading that particular scene and the emotions I had, and said, you have to come to Clinton College. And he responded back the next day, I'll be glad to come to Clinton College. So I got in touch with Dr. McNeil, and we had to make some arrangements to get him here. But I'm so glad to have David Dennis Jr. here today. As I said, he's the author of The Movement Made Us. But what I didn't know until I read the book is that he was also part of the movement, or at least participated in the movement in Charlotte for justice for Kenneth Lamont Scott. He's the son of David Jr., as I said, was a part of the Freedom Rides. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, and Huffington Post. And he's also a recipient of the 2021 American Mosaic Journalism Prize, the National Association of Black Journalism Excellence Salute, and an award winner of one of Root's 100 most influential African Americans of the year 2020. He's also a graduate of Davidson College. I found out he spent some time on Livingstone's campus. He's been all around Clinton, and today we're happy to have him at Clinton College. So I'm going to ask that you would give a round of applause to our guest for the day, Mr. David Dennis Jr. And we're going to just have a conversation today. Dr. McCoy and I are co-moderators, but we just want to have a dialogue with Mr. Dennis and allow you also to engage with some questions. If you have questions, there's a mic set up here. We ask that you would go to the mic and state your question, but be sure to do so in the mic because we're recording this and there are persons watching online. I want to begin, Mr. Dennis, by just asking you to reflect on the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s and how that impacts what we see in society today.
First of all, hi, how's everybody doing today, this morning? Thank you all for coming out and listening. I hope to have a conversation. I love talking to students. I used to teach at Morehouse, and this is my element. So feel free to talk. If a question hits you, let's have a conversation. So it's an interesting question. So I grew up. I'm a movement baby, as the book indicates. My dad was one of the original Freedom Riders. Helped organize the 1964 Freedom Summer. Really close friends with Medgar Evers. He saw him about an hour before he was assassinated. Does everybody know who Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner are? Do we know these people? Three civil rights workers who were essentially lynched in Mississippi in 1964. My dad was supposed to be in the car with them. He had bronchitis, and they told him to stay home. So it's very close to me not being here. Because of what this country has tried to do to my dad and my family. But growing up as a movement baby has taught me what is possible through organized resistance in America, right? It has taught me that in Mississippi, right, which was the most, and still is in a lot of ways, the most sort of pressed upon place by this country, right, that they have tried to terrorize Black folks, is where a lot of the organization and resistance movement in this country was birthed, right there in Mississippi, right? And obviously Mississippi is still going through a whole, does everybody know what's going on in Mississippi right now? What's that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so in my hometown in Jackson, Mississippi, there is no clean water right now. They just got water pressure back. After a week of no water pressure, people are trying to get bottles of water to drink, to bathe in, to brush their teeth, to cook with. And it's in large part because of a white supremacist state legislature that does not want the Black folks in the majority Black city that votes for majority Black representation to have anything. And so, you may look at that and say, all right, why would anybody want to live in Jackson? Why would anybody want to live in Mississippi? But Jackson and Mississippi is the birthplace of a lot of how we got free. A lot of the things that we understand about getting free as Black folks started and has been, kept up, perpetuated in places like Jackson, Mississippi.
So understanding that Mississippi is the birthplace of a lot of the oppression that takes place in this country, how will we help our students to understand what that looks like? I'm old enough to have known the civil rights movement when it was the civil rights movement, all right? But unless they take a class, these students really did not know that. So how do we help them to understand the significance of the legacy of white supremacy, not just in Mississippi, but in the whole country? How that still affects their own lives right now, they may not even realize it. How do we get them to see the kinds of struggles that I have experienced and that you have experienced?
Can I open that question up to because I want to ask y'all first to see where everybody else here is. How do you feel white supremacy and oppression is impacting your lives on a day-to-day basis? Or not at all? Being followed around grocery stores. What else? Say, making us act more violent. Okay. What else? How we interact with certain peers, things like that. One of the things about being Black in this country is that this will impact every single walk of life. Everything that you do is impacted by the fact that you are Black in America. And it's not our fault. It's not because of us. It's because that we were brought into this country for the sole purpose of providing a labor to basically create an economy in this country, right? Slave labor was the driving economic force in America for hundreds of years. And once, they had no use for us in slave labor, they created prison industrial complex to continue that, right? To put us in jails, to make us continue to work for free, right? And there is no incentive in this country to do anything to, alleviate that, right? The benefit that they see for Black folks is to work or die or both, right? And so that impacts every single walk of life, right? The fact that, Harvard has an endowment that is larger than all the HBCUs combined, right? That impacts your daily life as people in the HBCU, right? And I was born in Louisiana, right? And we know about hurricane season, right? And that we know about coming after the 17th anniversary of Katrina, that this is not a natural disaster, that this is something that happens because they put Black folks in most vulnerable positions to be impacted by environmental racism. Everybody know what environmental racism is? Yes, no, yeah. So it's like where you put Black folks in a position to be more vulnerable from heat, from flooding, from pollution, from things like that. Like every walk of life is impacted by the fact that this country is built to do the most harm to Black folks, right? So what do we do about that? The first thing is acknowledging that and understanding that. And then the second thing is figuring out what we can do to overcome that.
Great. So, David, I want to thank you for coming to this campus. Like Dr. Broadnax, I felt in a very visceral sense the power of the story that you tell, especially the intergenerational piece of it. And my hope and dream and prayer for this generation, for these students, is for them to fully understand what we're talking about today and how it does impact them. so that they will be motivated and inspired. Not everybody's going to be Martin Luther King or Medgar Evers or Malcolm X or Fannie Lou Hamer, but the real foot soldiers of the movement are what made it possible, right? And I often say that there would be no civil rights movement without HBCUs. So I'd like for you to, for a moment, kind of talk about knowing your dad as a product of Dillard University and the great legacy of HBCUs in Louisiana, having taught at Morehouse, woohoo, in Atlanta. Talk about what you feel is both the historical significance and the contemporary relevance of HBCUs.
Yeah, so HBCUs are the centerpiece of a lot of black movement, work. A lot of the people that we talk about went to HBCUs, including my dad, which he went to Dillard University. And I'll tell you the story about how he got involved in the movement. He was a freshman at Dillard. He was going to be engineer. That was what my dad wanted to be engineer. It was 1960. He had no interest in any civil rights movement work. The folks at Dillard and Xavier had already done a few sit-ins. They'd been arrested. My dad had no interest doing any of that stuff. And so he's walking down campus one day and he sees Doris Castle in New Orleans, who was one of the pioneers of the New Orleans movement and core. And she was trying to recruit people to come to meetings at core. And my dad had no interest in anything that she was talking about, didn't want to go to the meetings, but he wanted to take Doris Castle out on a date. He thought she was cute. And so my dad tries to holler at Doris Castle, does not go well. But she says, if you come to some of these core meetings, I will take you on a date. And so he kept going to core meetings and eventually was involved in the sit-in and was arrested, and the movement work went from there. My dad never got the date with Doris Castle, but that's how it started. And so a lot of people have similar stories about being at HBCUs because this is where a lot of organizing, a lot of planning, a lot of learning about where we are and where we should go happens there. But it doesn't just happen at HBCUs, right? It happens wherever black folks gather. It happens in the black church, traditionally, has been a place of movement work. Barbershops, salons, things like that, or restaurants, black-owned restaurants, like wherever black folks gather, we're always talking about getting free, right? Which I learned later in life. My grandmother was a beautician, right? And we just thought of her as a beautician. And what we learned later was that the Black Beauticians Group in Shreveport, Louisiana, was one of the most influential movement groups in that city because that's where black folks went, right? Where could you go and talk to black folks about what's going on without having to worry about white folks listening to you? You go to the beauty salon, barbershop, things like that. So one of the things I want people to get from this book and this work is that each person here, your parents or grandparents or great grandparents did something in this country to help get black folks free. Like, how many of y'all have asked your grandparents about their lives? Or if your grandparents have sat down and talked to you about their lives and about what they went through? Like, you will learn that you come from a heritage or a lineage of strong black folks who have done a ton of things to get us free and to free themselves. And I think that one of the problems is that we hear about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Medgar Evers, and we think that, these are the only handful of important people, but every single black person in this country has done something to move us forward. And I want us to feel that pride and talk to people in our family. I would not have known this stuff if I had not talked to my elders. And I just hope that, one thing I hope this book does inspires you to talk to your elders and ask them questions, just simple questions like, what was it like growing up? And then, figure out where to go from there.
Before I ask the next question, I wanted to see if there are any questions from the students. If you don't have one now, start thinking of one that you can ask. You've got a wealth of information sitting right in front of you, and I don't want you to miss this opportunity to engage with the personality on our campus. There are two things I wanted to bring up and that I would hope that you could talk about. Two words, connected and protracted, right? One is, I don't think, because I did not realize, and I'm doubting if many of our students realize, the connection over the years. We were talking right before we got started about a through line in history, the Black freedom struggle, really going back to slavery through Reconstruction and Jim Crow and civil rights, and now what Peniel Joseph's book, The Third Reconstruction, is talking about. So many of our students, for instance, I was talking to someone about this, that my grandmother was born in Camden, South Carolina in 1908. Her grandmother was born a slave. I mean, that's mind blowing to think how close we are to that ugly atrocity of human history. But it also brings to bear on the conversation that it's not ancient, it's not disconnected. When I was a student at Morehouse, there was, and you probably know about the story in Forsyth County, Georgia, where Black folks were run out of, back in the early part of the 20th century, a Black family, several Black families were run out of Forsyth County, never to return. And it was understood that you never crossed the boundary to go back to Forsyth County. Well, something happened that brought us together. Hosea Williams, and that's a person you all should know, Hosea Williams, look him up. He was one of Dr. King's lieutenants, led a march in Forsyth County. And in 1987, little kids were yelling the N-word and throwing bottles at marchers in 1987. And so we did what Black folks do. We went back and got reinforcement. And everybody from the AUC, Dr. Brown was a student at Clark College during that time, all of us showed up and marched in Forsyth County. And it was amazing to think all these years later that we were still facing it. And then here we are now in 2022, experiencing the same kind of systemic and now very blatant racism. So the connectedness, and then I want to talk about being protracted, right? It is a long struggle, and many people give up too soon and don't realize that the baton has constantly been passed from generation to generation. And so we should not give up, because this is a period that'll make you give up. People are just throwing up their hands and saying white supremacy is just intractable. There's nothing we can do to change this. Well, we know that's not true. By what your father did and his ancestors, our ancestors, it's a protracted struggle. And to bring it close to home, we were talking about this earlier, Congressman John Lewis, who just died a couple of years ago, a real lion of the civil rights movement. One of the first places he was beaten as a freedom rider, what your dad was a part of, was in Rock Hill, South Carolina. So students, you should know that story. You should know that history. And the connected, I'm looping it back around. When I was a student at Morehouse, I was a congressional intern for John Lewis. So it lets you know that there are so many connections to history that we have that we might not even realize, but we are part of a great legacy. So your book really drives that home. And I want you to kind of talk about that from your vantage point as a relatively young man. Why would you even take an interest in this, and why you see your father's legacy being your legacy?
So I started thinking about, well, I'd always thought I was going to write a book about my dad and his stories, because he just has just like tremendous stories. I mean, as a kid, you hear about your dad in like car chases, and there's like gunfights and all this stuff. And he thinks like it's cool, and I write about it, right? And I really started thinking about this seriously when Donald Trump was elected, right? Because it was really terrifying to me to think about all the stuff that my dad and his peers went through, and this country still elects the most white supremacist president that you can imagine them electing since Ronald Reagan, right? Like, we're still back here. And it really felt like, what do y'all care about? Like, what are some things that you guys are thinking about? What is the anxiety that you have about the world? Gentrification. What else? Rights being taken away. Taxes. What else? COVID, LGBTQ rights, abortion rights, women's right to choose, and these things, voting rights, right? When you think about all this stuff, it feels like too much, right? Like it feels like it's too much, like it's too much to fight. And it can feel really overwhelming. Like, how can I fight a disease, right? A virus that is killing black folks at 10 times the rate it was killing white folks, right? Like, how can I fight a Starbucks that is replacing a black-owned business that's been there for 80 years? What can I do about that, right? What can I do about the fact that we may be, 2024 may be the last election that we ever have in this country, right? Like, when you sit down and think about it, it feels like too much. Like, it feels like it's too much to deal with. And so I felt that. Like, when I was looking at, when I was up and I was watching CNN or whatever I was watching, and those states were turning red and they were saying Donald Trump was the president, it felt like way too much to bear. And even it does now, right? When you have a Supreme Court that is not acting like a court and is taking away rights, and they're stripping away voting rights. I'm in Georgia, they're stripping away voting rights right now. Like I said, people don't have clean water to drink, right? And it's terrifying if you're a woman in this country and you are trying to, have a healthy pregnancy, right? And so what I wanted to take solace in is the fact that those folks back then in the 60s and civil rights movement did not seek out to solve every problem. They just cared about one thing and they did something about that one thing, right? There were some folks who cared about not wanting to sit in the back of the bus. Some folks wanted to eat at lunch counters. Some people wanted to vote. Some people wanted to ride a bus across state lines without being beaten, right? And they did something about that thing. And what I hope everybody does is, like, if you do something, then like you're doing something, right? If you do one thing, maybe you'll be compelled to do two things, or the person next to you do one thing, and everybody will sort of find their place. And if we're unified in that, we can fight all of these things sort of together, right? But I think one of the things that we feel like is that if I'm not Martin Luther King, if I'm not Malcolm X, then I shouldn't do anything because I don't feel like, I don't have time for all that. I got classes to go to, right? Like, you got to find your role. Like, I have a specific role that I feel like is important. That role does not include me going to the street and getting tear gas. Like, I do not feel like doing that, right? Some people are fine. Like, some people are fine taking to the streets. Like, that's what they feel like that their thing is. That's not my ministry, right? And so that's fine. But other people will take up that mantle, right? And I feel like sometimes we feel like we got to do all things and do everything, but folks back then were not doing all things and everything. Like, there were some families who all they did was just, if you needed some chicken at 6 o'clock and you're doing work, come over to my house and I'll house you, right? And that was their impact on the movement. And I feel like if we feel compelled to do one small thing, then like we can sort of turn that into a bigger thing.
Let me ask you, how old was your father when he joined the movement?
So he was 20. He was 21. Okay. Yeah.
He was old.
Right.
I mean, well, the point I'm wanting to make, we've talked about John Lewis. John Lewis was 17 when he first started marching in Nashville. David's father joined the second leg of the Freedom Rise. The first leg had stopped in Montgomery. He got on in Montgomery, first was stopped in Birmingham. He went on to Montgomery and then on to New Orleans. That second leg was organized by Diane Nash. She was 19. The majority of the persons who are now lions of the civil rights movement were in their teens. Martin Luther King was an old man. He was 26. All right. But, what we really don't capture is that the movement that started in the 1960s was done by teenagers. The four men who sat at the lunch counter at Woolworth in Greensboro, they were teenagers. The point I'm wanting to make is that these were persons who were just like you, who were sitting in an HBCU, looking around at what happened or was taking place in their world, in the community around them, and decided to do something.
Yeah, I'm a old man. I'm 36. I'm an old man. These are young men here. Y'all are young, and so I guess I want to ask y'all a question. How can we support you all in anything you are trying to do, anything you're passionate about, anything you want to make change about? How can we support you? You got your president's ear right here. How can we support you? Did you say something? Say somebody? No.
Is there something in the community that you feel needs to be changed?
Everything's good? What's that?
He said we're putting them on the spot.
I've been on the spot for the last 30 minutes, man. Come on. So what needs to be changed? Communicate. Was that you that said that? Communication. What do you mean communication?
Would you go to the mic?
Oh, it's SJ president. Congratulations. That's awesome.
I would say talking to others to come up with ways to fix things instead of just telling themselves or just tweeting about it, but actually putting it into effect and being serious about it.
So figuring out sort of how to plan, how to gather, things like that. Okay, how to organize. How can me as an old person, how can I help you do that?
Like write like rules down and start putting it to order.
Okay. So a lot of organization, things like that. All right. What do you care about?
Like just making, I know like everybody don't agree with everything, but like being happy and like basically having a truce, like being able to deal with it instead of like being upset or not being able to be around that person because they're thinking differently, but being able to at least able to deal with it.
Okay. All right. What else? What else we care about? And how can we help you? I ask that because, we do talk a lot about the young folks in the movement. My dad was a young person in the movement. But there were elders in the movement who were there prior to them being there. They're like Jackson, Mississippi had a whole infrastructure of movement stuff. Ella Baker went down to Mississippi and sort of built the NAACP around there from the ground up. And there were organizations of people who were lawyers and teachers and people owning different businesses who were setting the foundation. Like these young kids got help from their elders also, right? And I know sometimes I might feel like old folks like me talk to you and talk at you and don't listen and things like that. And I think it's important. Like this book would not be possible if not without two-way communication between me and my dad, right? Without me asking him questions, him talking to me, and understanding each other and coming to a middle ground. And I feel like sometimes as young folks, we tell you like y'all got to figure it out, right? Like y'all just it's up to y'all. Y'all figure it out. And we kind of leave y'all hanging a lot of times. Whereas, the elders have been through this stuff. The elders have organized. The elders have done a ton of things. And like there needs to be a two-way communication because they, don't know my dad don't know nothing about hashtags and like social activism and how to TikTok and tell people about different things. You don't know that stuff, right? And you may not know some of the grassroots things that they did, right? So I think that we have to figure out how to get this two-way communication, not talking at each other, but to each other, and like the idea that intergenerational movement work is how we get this thing done.
All right, y'all think about some more questions before we wrap up. So, I see a hand. Yeah, come to the mic. Come to the mic.
I just wanted to ask you, like, personally, how you felt about like the increasing like uprise of like hate and like blatant racism that's going on now. I feel like it's been a really big gap of it, and I want to know how you felt about it.
How do you feel about it? How do you feel about it?
I'm angry about it. I don't. There's not a lot we can do. I don't feel like I feel like we're capped at a certain point of what we can do about it, other than bring it out on social media because that's our generation. But personally, um, it makes me angry at the audacity of some of it, the reasoning behind a lot of the things that are said, or the blatant racism that is put out. It's unnecessary, or it's just, it has no reason really. And I usually ask this question to a lot of people who do come and talk about a movement, like how they really felt about it. So
Yeah, I mean, it pissed me off. Like, I mean, I think we got to understand. You got to understand that the January 6th Capitol riot, that was a race riot. We understand that, right? Like, that was white folks storming the Capitol because they felt like they were losing their country to a bunch of black folks and queer folks and all these people who were taking their country from them, right? And that's really what this is this like backlash, the fact that whenever black folks, whenever marginalized folks do anything, right, these white folks are going to do what they can in the most violent ways to take it back, right? And I agree with a lot of what you said. Like, this is not on us to fix, right? Like, white folks got to fix themselves, right? Like, they got to figure out, like, they got to go talk to their aunts and uncles about why they're out here doing this, or why they're allowing this, or why they're in a restaurant talking to folks who are using the N-word, not saying anything about it, or allowing this to happen, right? Like, white folks need to be extremely ashamed of the racism and white supremacy that they have, and they need to do something about it, right? I don't have much faith that they will do that because we don't know. We have not seen a precedent for white folks feeling enough shame to change their own actions, what they do in this country. But, I do know and I do feel as though we do have a history of black folks pushing through that and making it better and finding a way, right? So this was expected. This is what they're going to do. Like, whenever we progress somewhere, they are going to fight back in the way that they feel like they know how. And oftentimes this country is through violence.
So,
In the hand, were you going? Did you have your hand up in the back with sunglasses on? Mm-hmm. Oh, all right.
Nick. Okay.
We have a few questions from
Nick.
offline.
Here's another one here, and then we're going to go to the online questions.
Yeah.
Come to the mic.
Okay, you can go after him. Yeah.
Have you ever got affected by racism just because your dad, like, has it, like, got brought to your household? Like, when you sleep your head at?
I mean, what was the last part you said? Oh, no, nothing like that. No, but I mean, I did. A few years ago when I was teaching at Morehouse, I wrote an article that was basically, you remember Tom Brady had the "Make America Great Again" hat, and I was like, why are y'all okay with him doing that, but mad that Colin Kaepernick is kneeling for the anthem? Like, that is like that Make America Great Again hat is the most un-American thing you can do, right? And so, some dude called Morehouse and said that they were coming to shoot up the school because I was teaching there, and I was sort of like, I mean, clearly you don't know that where you're going, like talking like that about a more like coming in a pickup truck, like 4 white kids coming in a pickup truck, like people know what you're trying to. So anyway, so I had to talk to Homeland Security. I had to do all that stuff, and that's probably as bad as it got. Of course, yeah, online I get all kind of threats and all that stuff, but like, they ain't gonna do nothing. So.
Come right on.
Okay. There was a volleyball player that encountered something like that at a game,
She was at BYU, and she was called like racial slurs and things like that. And I was just wondering how you felt about that, because we know that although we can spread all these hashtags and things like that, like the school wouldn't handle it appropriately. So like, how do you feel that should be handled?
Everybody familiar with this volleyball player? Or she at Duke, and this student at BYU was yelling racial slurs. Like racism does not like anything, like any crime or anything like that. Racism does not happen in a vacuum, right? So if you have one person yelling racial slurs and a group of people around them not stopping them, then you have a group of people who are yelling racial slurs, right? And again, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. So you got to look at BYU and the history of BYU, right? And the fact that BYU is probably one of the most racially, homogenized places in the country, and an anti-black establishment whose president essentially got rid of a lot of, teachings about race theory and things like that in the school prior to that, right? And you have a coach who goes out and tries to talk to the students and does not say race or black or anything like that, and essentially gives them, less, it says it's okay pretty much by not addressing what the thing is, right? And so, this could have happened anywhere, and it probably does happen in a lot of places. Even if you talk professionally, basketball players talk all the time about the racial slurs they get when they go to Utah, right? And so this is all racism happens from top to bottom, right? So the person yelling a racial slur is getting that from another institution. It's like that when I was a little bit younger, there was this belief that racism would just die out as people got older, right? That like if all the old racists died, then we'll just live in this utopia, which like clearly that's not the case, because like there are extremely young racists, right? And they're being taught this, and they're being institutionalized or radicalized to believe in the things that they say. So that situation seems to be just like another sort of example of that.
I want to follow up on this because we've got a lot of athletes in the room. So you're looking at a lot of basketball players, men and women, and volleyball players here. And you operate in the world of sports. And we just lost Bill Russell not too long ago. And the greatness of Bill Russell was not just all the titles and his prowess on the basketball court. Bill Russell faced racism head on. I'm from Boston, so I know racism firsthand. And he had to deal with it in the ugliest of ways. But there's an iconic picture of Bill Russell and Jim Brown and Muhammad Ali coming together, standing together against empire. And we hardly see that today. There are some cases of it. But I'm wondering if you could talk to these athletes from your vantage point, kind of tease this out a little bit with them about the role that athletes can play in the fight for social justice, and not just concerned about money and cash and cars, but how can we really impact and change the world?
Yeah, so Bill Russell. So my dad met Bill Russell a couple times, and I'm telling you that because of where Bill Russell was when they met. Bill Russell used to go down to Jackson, Mississippi in the heat of the movement as a 7 foot tall black man who stood out and was trying to do what he could and donate money and do all this stuff, like really putting his life in danger. I think one of the things that people have to understand is a complicated question, I think, because the athlete back then had a lot to lose, but they did not have as much to gain financially as athletes do now. And so athletes, I think, are weighing that idea, right? I could feed my families for generations if I just keep my mouth shut, right? And however, there is a balance, I think, that you can reach. I think that there is a way that you can be an athlete and make $50 million and talk about getting black folks free and saying things what they are, right? Like, you know, I think about Deshaun Watson, right? And the fact that you have a locker room full of black men who are who are willing to play with a player who has been credibly accused of sexually assaulting 24 mostly black women, right? Like, you have to at least speak up and say, I do not want to play with this dude, right? I could not live with myself if I were saying I'm gonna go win a Super Bowl with this dude, and thinking about the fact that these women have to watch him on TV, possibly hold up a trophy and do things like that. Like, at least we can start there, and then we can move on to something else. But I do think a lot of times athletes about I want the biggest bag. I want that bag, right? And if I speak up for different things, I won't get the bag. We saw, because the NFL made an example out of Colin Kaepernick. They said, you do this, we'll get you, you're not coming back in the league. And for a football player, like, we think about them as being rich, but a lineman, your average is 3 years, you make $300,000 a year, right? That's not generational wealth. So a lot of folks are trying to weigh that option, but again, everybody's got to find their space and find their lane. LeBron James has more liberty to do things that ninth man on the team from the D League is going to be able to do. So I do think one thing we can do is push these athletes to speak up about these things, right? Or to push these athletes and tell them that what they're doing is not cool, right? Like, I'm personally one of those people who thinks that if you were a billionaire, right, then you are contributing a net negative to society, right? Because in order to become a billionaire, you have to oppress a lot of folks, right? So what are we going to do when somebody does wrong, right? Like, we can't even why are we still wearing, I'm not trying to, I'm not looking at nobody's feet, but why are we still wearing Yeezys when this man is out here wearing Make America Great Again hats? Like, why are we doing this? Like, we can at least not do that, right? Now, I know that, there are some, like, we all wearing Nikes. I love Nikes. Nike uses child labor, right? Some things, iPhones are, made by capitalists who use their money to oppress folks. Like, we can't cut everything off, right? But at the very least, we can put our foot down on some things, right? Like, some of us, we just have to have a line somewhere, right? Like, I try not to go to Walmart, but if Walmart got a sale, Walmart's right by the house, or if it's after midnight, I'm going to go to Walmart, right? We're going to order from it. But we have to at least try in those things, train our brains to be willing to try that stuff.
Couple of questions online.
Yes, this is from Jeffrey Smith. Why do you think these teenagers during the civil rights movement found it necessary to risk their lives for what they believed in? And what do you think is lacking in the younger generations that keeps us from protesting, uprising until change happens?
How do y'all feel about that question? So you said it's a risk, big risk. Anybody else? How do y'all feel about that question? Yeah.
I didn't hear. We couldn't hear you.
What do you mean? They don't know what's true. There's two things about that question I want to talk about. I don't think most of the people in the civil rights movement were willing to risk their lives. I think a lot of them ended up being at risk for what they were trying to do. Right? Like, I think some people hopped on the Freedom Ride bus and said, I think we might be fine. Like, these things happened to them. Their lives were put at risk. People did not go into the movement thinking or expecting or even being willing to die. Medgar Evers had children, always talked about the fact that he wanted to grow old with his children. You think Dr. King wanted to die when he got kids, right? Like, we talk about risking their lives, the idea of black folks willingly went in to die, and that's not the case. Black folks are trying to get free, and white folks tried to kill them, right? And I think the second part of that question is the idea of why isn't your generation marching, right? And I will push back on that by saying that in 2020, the George Floyd protest was the largest organized protest in United States history, right? I believe that young folks are protesting. I believe that young folks are doing what y'all believe y'all can do for the most part, right? I believe that generally when we have those kind of protests, things change. It's the country that changed and decided that we're not going to care about protests anymore. We're not going to do what's the will of the people. And that's sort of the difference. But I do believe that I believe if something were to happen in Rock Hill, South Carolina tomorrow, heaven forbid, I believe that all of y'all will be out doing what y'all can I believe in y'all. I just want to say that I believe that y'all will be doing something about it. He has a question on.
Yeah, I have one more. This is from AD, and it goes back to your comment earlier. How do you go about being a part of such a big movement without feeling that you are not doing enough? It feels like we're so limited, but there's so much to do.
I think you just do something. You just do something. Cash app $20 to something. Or go or just don't buy something. Don't go eat at Chick-fil-A, right? Or there's a march, you go stand out and do a march, right? Or something. Like I don't feel like I just feel like everybody can figure out something to do, and then you might figure out the next thing.
There's a hand way in the back. Come up front.
Good. And this is going to be the last question before we wrap up. And Dr. Brown, you're going to make announcements. Okay.
How do you feel about the riots going on?
The riots, which
On the behalf of like BLM and all these other things happening with protests and stuff, there's riots injuring others as well as themselves, going against the police and everything.
who do you feel is rioting?
Mainly the people that stand for BLM, but at the same time, it's not the people that are actively trying to help. They're more hurting it than helping.
So the Black Lives Matter protest is an overwhelmingly peaceful protest. Like overwhelmingly, like 98% of the protests are peaceful, right? As opposed to, say a January 6th protest, right? And that's sort of the misinformation that we're talking about. Like people, like it gets painted as this super violent, as rioting, right? But like the same people who are saying that black folks are rioting for Black Lives Matter are the same people who are saying the January 6th people are peacefully protesting, right? So I would say that, most of these protests are peaceful, but I would also say that it takes a whole lot of restraint to watch somebody, slowly die for 8 minutes and not want to flip a table. So I'm not going to chastise folks for feeling that need. I would, we don't all have to channel it that way, but I would also I understand where that feeling comes from.
And what about the people taking advantage of the situation by stealing?
By stealing, like
From businesses, either small or big, anything.
oh well, sometimes
looting.
Sometimes wealth redistribution is not necessarily a bad thing. So
Okay.
So, one last Bernie question.
you said looting. I think the idea, quote unquote, of looting is a complicated thing to talk about, right? Like I do recall during Katrina, that when like the mayor, or not the mayor, the like there was military folks in there were told to shoot on sight if you saw people taking things out of stores in Katrina to survive, right? And I do know that there were black folks in Katrina who were getting loaves of bread and trying to get what they could to feed their family. They were told to shoot them on sight. I also do know that white folks doing the same thing, and they were called scavengers and trying to keep folks alive, right? And if we want to talk about looting, right, we want to talk about the biggest looters in this country, we can talk about places like, businesses who come in and don't pay wages and, steal land and, hire folks for less than, what they should get paid and take, tax breaks and line their pockets or buy back their own stocks and drain the resources of neighborhoods. Like, we want to talk about looting, we can talk about that compared to somebody taking a PlayStation 5 out of Best Buy.
This is why, thank you for that. This is why critical race theory is important. This is why studying African American history is important. This is why studying capitalism is important. You all are asking questions. These are very good questions that people assume they have the answer for. Like, there's a simple answer. The truth is, it is very complicated. And this country's history, I mean, America was built on looting. Colonialists looted a whole country. Ask Native Americans what looting is. Ask Wilmington, North Carolina. Ask Tulsa, Oklahoma, what looting is, right? And it's amazing how the narrative gets told. For years, people got away calling it the Tulsa riot. Folks had done something that brought the misery onto themselves. When you read the story of Tulsa, it's a massacre of epic proportions. It's genocide, right? But if you don't have anybody to teach you or at least lead you into thinking differently, then you will accept what other people are telling you, right? So it's easy for us to go to the looting narrative, right? It's easy to say these are black folks stealing. But when you have been economically exploited for years, you can understand why people out of desperation are trying to do something different, right? This is why you all are in college. That's why y'all are at Clinton. So you can understand how to address that. As we wrap this up, I hope that you all, and we have not done a campus read in a while, and so I might give a hint to Dr. Randolph and the faculty and students to think about doing a campus read of this book. Have you all been benefited? Have you been blessed by this conversation with David Dennis Jr. today? I want to thank you for sharing. And he insisted that we do it this way so it could be more of a conversation rather than a lecture. And I think this has been really beneficial. And I want to thank you for sharing with us. We say to every one of our guests who come that you're now part of the family. So you have a standing invitation to come back and be at Clinton. And we hope to have another opportunity to engage you. And when you do come back, we'll have the campus read. That might be the best way to do it. After we have a campus read, to have you come back and share with us after the students have read the book, and then we can do a book signing. But I'm going to get my book signed today.
All right, let's do it. Let's do it.
All right. Thank you. Let's give it up again for David Dennis. Let's give it up for Dr. Broadnax. Thank you. And Dr. Brown will now come with our closing announcements.
So in terms of organizations, I think locally is the way to go. So I'm not sure what the South Carolina or the Rock Hill organization, there's a BLM chapters here, or any sort of reproductive rights chapters, LGBTQIA plus organizations, but I definitely think locally is always where we should sort of focus our attention.
Great. Thank you so much. Just some announcements today, starting off with, we will start our mask mandate for 10 days, okay? That's effective today. We want to make sure we keep you all safe. Your health and safety remain our first priority on this campus. And we have noticed an uptick of some cases, and so we want to make sure we're getting out in front of it. So I appreciate you guys following through with that. We do appreciate that, okay? Career Fair, September 8th, 1 to 4 o'clock. 1 p.m. to 4 o'clock p.m. Make sure you take advantage of that. That is super important. I always say college is the one place where jobs will come to you, because when you graduate, they don't come to you. You have to go find them. So take advantage of the Career Fair. Gospel Choir, we have your rehearsal tonight at 8 o'clock. I'm so excited about that for our Gospel Choir. There's still time for you all to jump in there, okay? 8 o'clock p.m. Our volleyball game, our volleyball team is playing tomorrow, Johnson C. Smith, so that's interstate. So we need everybody to show up and show out. They'll play tomorrow at 6:00 p.m. 6:00 p.m. All right. So again, we want to say thank you to Dr. Dennis. Before we leave, I'm just going to say we really appreciate it. We're going to get those books, and we'll be ready when he comes back to have them signed. Let's give him one more time for a round welcome to Clinton College. And yeah,
Thank
and
you
y'all
all.
know,
Thank
y'all
y'all.
know how we do it. CC. Oh, come on. Now he's got to go back to Lanham and tell him how to do it. CC. CC. All right, there we go.
Thank y'all for having me. They have my contact information. If you have any questions, anything y'all need, they'll send it to me and I'll respond to you for sure.
All right. Y'all take care. Enjoy lunch. Have a great day.
I just wanted to come up here and talk about. Oh yeah, y'all did that morning practice today.
Yeah, 4 a.m. at the freaking Hill.